Did you know? When Game Freak was deciding what kind of Pokemon to make for Gen 6, they were thinking about the Pokemon World Championships. Talking to Nintendo Dream Magazine, they said too many competitors were using the same Pokemon over and over, and the same kind of people kept winning, with series director Junichi Masuda saying, in 2011 and 2012, the Junior, Senior, and Master divisions were all won by Americans, but this time, lots of different nationalities won, which really gave it a sense of being the Pokemon World Championships. They were also excited to see a wider variety of Pokemon getting used competitively. What they weren't as excited about, though, was getting whooped by their own fans. At a one-time event called the Pokemon Game Show in Tokyo, where people got to play X and Y a few months before launch, developers like Shigeki Morimoto battled against fans, including former world champ Ray Rizzo. In the end, the fans won and the developers lost. They even got beat by elementary school kids. Morimoto told Nintendo Dream, "It's true, unfortunately. Absolutely, I was nervous, and the battle stressed me out. I really did want to win." Speaking of the World Championships, if you dig around in X and Y's internal data, you can find a modernized remix of Gen 1's Champion Battle theme. The track never plays anywhere in Kalos. In fact, the only place you could have heard it legit was at the real-life Pokemon World Championships. Most of you didn't attend, so here's a few seconds of the original, compared to the remix. Earlier Pokemon games could take months, even years, to get released around the world. Gold and Silver, for example, launched in Japan in 1999, America in 2000, and Europe in 2001. The Pokemon Company had long sought to streamline the game's translation so that they could sync up a worldwide launch, but it wasn't until X and Y they finally pulled it off.
Coming worldwide, October 12th, 2013.
But why did it matter? According to Masuda, a big reason is the element of surprise. In previous generations, overseas fans would have already seen all the new Pokemon in magazines or online and had story elements spoiled because the games launched in Japan long before they arrived on foreign shores. X and Y contain 800,000 Japanese characters, and localizing them into 7 languages was no easy task. But achieving that feat came at a cost. Masuda said that there were originally some more text-heavy features, but to meet the localization deadline, those features ultimately became cut content. Speaking of which, when most fans picture the devs, they usually think of the director, Pokemon designers, and maybe programmers. The folks who translate the games to different languages all around the world, the localizers, are usually pretty far down that list. But according to Masuda, if it wasn't for Pokemon's French localizers, Kalos wouldn't have been based in France. X and Y's themes are beauty, bonding, and evolution, with a special emphasis on beauty. Kalos could have easily taken after somewhere else beautiful, like California or Italy, but Masuda said, "We chose beauty because we wanted something beautiful on the 3DS. There were several possible regions, but I was impressed by how the localizers who translated the previous games into French were very particular about the beauty of the language. So I decided to base Kalos on France." More specifically, Kalos is based on northern France, as you can see when one map is superimposed over the other. Quite a few real-life locations served as inspiration as well, like Route 10, which is based on the Carnac Stones in France's northwest province of Brittany. Local folklore says these 10,000 rocks stand in straight lines because they're a Roman legion that the Pope turned into stone. Prism Tower is based on the Eiffel Tower. Parfum Palace is the Palace of Versailles, and so on. Some of the Pokemon themselves drew from French culture, in the same way the Unova Pokemon were inspired by America. In other words, those localizers had a massive, massive impact that'll forever continue into future generations. But that we only got the northern half of France, combined with the fact X and Y added fewer new Pokemon than any previous generation, less than half as many as Gen 5 for example, led some fans to speculate that Pokemon Z would include new areas comprising South Kalos, populated with new species. So naturally, the South Kalos Pokedex leaked online, detailing all the new Pokemon set to appear in the Z version. They were fake, of course, but an interesting part of Gen 6 history nonetheless, which some fans at the time thought might actually be true. Would have been cool if they were, though, honestly. The south of France is famously quite beautiful, and actually a new area like South Kalos wasn't as outlandish as some might think. In fact, it seems the Pokemon Company was strongly considering it, but not in Pokemon Z. Instead, as a DLC. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity released on 3DS in 2012, the year before X and Y. At launch, it had about 30 dungeons, then a little while later, it got substantial DLC in the form of 12 additional dungeons, plus 24 new music tracks. Soon after, before X and Y even released, a Japanese journalist asked Pokemon Company President Ishihara if X and Y were going to get DLC too. Ishihara said, "You mean like the DLC we made for Pokemon Mystery Dungeon? That's the hardest question you could have asked today, haha. We're considering a lot of things, but I can't give you an answer at this time. If they'd followed through, South Kalos is probably a bit optimistic. 12 new dungeons is probably more equivalent to new islands akin to Kanto's Sevi Islands. The Sevi Islands were based on islands off the coast of real-life Kanto in Japan, and France has some real-life islands as well. Or on the more pessimistic end, maybe a new battle frontier. But as we covered in depth in our Z video, Game Freak was busy making other games at the time, like Tembo the Badass Elephant. Ultimately, Gen 6 didn't get any DLC at all, and it wasn't until Gen 8 they started giving us DLC with new areas in Pokemon. Now, to address the meaning of Gen 6, according to Masuda, Pokemon Black and White's theme was polarity. The next games, Black 2 and White 2, had a theme of resonance. We went through all 12 years of Masuda's blog entries to find X and Y's theme, and found it was a bit more complicated, and you might say philosophically deeper than the games that came before. Here's our English translation of a blog he wrote 1 week after Gen 6's release. He said, "The themes are beauty, bonds, and evolution, but there's an even bigger theme. The world is full of wonderful encounters that depend on the circumstances we find ourselves in. If you were born 1 year earlier, you might have made an entirely different group of friends. If your tastes were different, you might have met different people. Suppose, too, that your parents never met. Everyone's life depends on the chance encounters they make. Instead of fighting, these encounters should be opportunities to build a better world together." The titles X and Y came from this idea. The letters suggest lines on an axis. The lines of both letters head in different directions, but there's a point at which they cross paths. I picked these letters with the idea of intersection in mind, the idea of common points we share with one another rather than our differences. Let's create a better world together. I developed these games to express that idea. Put simply, X and Y are the coordinates of a chance encounter, which could unfold in a huge, significant way, and we should take those as opportunities to make the world a better place. Everyone was expecting Pokemon Z would be Kalos' third version, and there were quite a few clues it was originally part of Game Freak's master plan, as we detailed in previous videos. It's worth pointing out, in geometry, in addition to X and Y, there's also a Z axis, only in three-dimensional spaces, of course. But Gen 6 was the first 3D generation, so it seems like it would have fit nicely with the generation's theme. That theme of intersection and chance encounters is driven home in X and Y's credit song, but only an acoustic version with subtitles is included in the actual games. No words are actually sung. But a version with lyrics does exist in multiple languages, and was first performed in English at the Pokemon Symphonic Evolutions concert in 2014, with Masuda himself as the conductor. In a Japanese interview, Masuda said, "The game also conveys this message, but I thought I could deliver it more directly if I set it to music. That it's a miracle that we were able to meet each other during the 100 or so years we get to live." Out of all 72 Pokemon added in Gen 6, the Phantump family might have the most interesting development. The only non-Japanese Pokemon designer, James Turner, used to work on spin-offs like Pokemon Colosseum and Battle Revolution. He later applied to join Game Freak, hoping he could work on mainline entries. As a part of the audition process, they had him design a Pokemon with a time limit of only 30 minutes. Under pressure, James came up with a ghost tree, which years later, after some revisions, turned into Phantump. James still has a lot of affection for Phantump, and frequently posts new art and video of it on Twitter. The Pokedex says Phantump are possessed by the spirits of children who died when they got lost in the forest. Lore-wise, it draws inspiration from Kodama, which are trees haunted by spirits from Japanese folklore. Anyone who tries to cut down a Kodama tree will have a terrible curse cast upon them. Phantump's plenty interesting as a Pokemon design, but we really bring it up so we can segue into some developers' deleted tweets with behind-the-scenes info the Pokemon Company apparently didn't want made public. In one of those tweets that James Turner deleted, but we archived, he said that he didn't come up with Phantump's lore himself, which was typical of all Kalos Pokemon. Game Freak has a sort of lore specialist who comes up with Pokedex entries and backstories for Pokemon other people drew. In other deleted tweets, he said designers don't get to name the creatures they create, pick their stats, or even their shiny colors. That last one has changed since Gen 6 though. Nowadays designers often do get to design their own shinies. There's one more deleted tweet worth dredging back up, this time from Toshinobu Matsumiya, who was a story writer for over 20 years from Pokemon Yellow all the way to Legends Arceus. After X and Y's launch, he tweeted out the series timeline, saying Generations 1 and 3 take place at the same time, then Gen 2 and 4 happen later. 3 years later, to be exact, that's stated explicitly in Gold and Silver. The events in Black and White happen after that, then finally, Black and White 2 and Pokemon X and Y take place at the very end of the timeline, or at least the end of the timeline at the time of X and Y's release, 2 years after the previous games to be exact, according to Professor Cedric Juniper. Matsumiya later deleted the tweet, as Pokedevs sometimes do when they've revealed too much behind-the-scenes info. Series director Junichi Masuda later threw cold water on fans trying to make sense of Pokemon having a singular timeline at all, saying, it starts to get a little complicated if you pay too much attention to timelines. Like, there might be a professor that appears and it wouldn't make sense at all if we applied that kind of timeline logic, so we try not to apply it too rigorously. Whether or not Pokemon has an official timeline or several timelines, as the guy who wrote the series story over 8 generations, Matsumiya seems he had one clearly defined in his head when he wrote them. Like when someone in Lumio City says Trainer Blue came to study abroad in Kalos, which makes sense if X and Y happen a few years after Red and Blue, but wouldn't make sense a few years before, when he was like a toddler. It's worth noting some versions of Grimsley's concept art said Gen 7 occurs 2 years after Gen 6, and thus X and Y aren't at the end of the timeline anymore. But that particular line got erased when the same art was published in the Alola Region Artworks book. Maybe that was kind of confusing, so here's the timeline summary. Keep in mind this is based on what the developers and games themselves have said, but the canonicity of some elements are still up for debate. We should also mention that the official Japanese Gen 1 Pokedex book says Red and Green take place in 1996, so you can work out the math yourself on what games take place in which year. And now for our last segment, that Pokemon X and Y feature the series' first transgender character. Maybe you've heard that before, but probably not the real story. The character is called Nova, and at the end of her battle, she says, yes, a mere half year ago, I was a black belt. Quite the transformation, wouldn't you say? Black belts are a male-only trainer type, and now Nova's a beauty, who can only be female. According to Legends of Localization, it's even more explicit in the original Japanese version, where Nova says, the power of medical science is awesome, wouldn't you say? Maybe you've heard this before, but have you ever seen Nova in-game with your own eyes? We're willing to bet you haven't, and never seen footage of her either. In fact, we spent hours looking and couldn't find footage of her in any YouTube playthroughs that cover the part of the game where she supposedly resides. You might have seen this photo, which is cut off and off system. As far as we can tell, it's the only image online, and it just gets copy-pasted over and over in viral tweets, trivia videos, and fan wikis. In the past, we've debunked similar occurrences where a random Twitter user created a story out of thin air, then it gets repeated as facts on news sites. Like how anime writer Takeshi Shudo supposedly said Professor Ivy's a lesbian in his book, even though his book never mentions Professor Ivy. By now, you probably see where this is headed, that Nova, the transgender beauty, never actually existed. But actually, she does exist. The point we're really trying to make is she's so thoroughly hidden that 99.9% of players would never encounter her. So hard to find, it seems footage of her has never made its way online until this video. She's in the Battle Maison, and only appears on normal difficulty, which is really like the tutorial, so most fans will only play normal once or never play it at all. Thanks to the Maison's randomized trainer lineup, you've got to beat 15 opponents in a row to even have a chance at seeing Nova, and even then the odds are 90% you still won't see her. It took us hours of playing and replaying the Battle Maison to finally encounter Nova, and it turns out she has a bit more dialogue, like, I've recently remade my life completely. I've been reborn as a beauty at last. And if you want to make your dreams a reality, then you have to be completely dedicated. Besides being deeply hidden in X and Y, we should also mention that in German versions, they changed it so Nova says she used to be a Pokemon breeder, who can be either male or female, and thus removing any indication that she's a trans character. Likewise, in the Korean version, she says she used to be a Taekwondo girl, a trainer class that doesn't even exist. Nova was also removed from Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire's Battle Mason in all languages, and replaced with a different beauty named Nohea. Nohea has similar dialogue, but instead of going from black belt to beauty, she's changed from madame to a beauty. In other words, her big transformation is just trying to look younger. And that's the full story of Pokemon's first transgender character, which, as far as we can tell, before today hasn't been told in its entirety. Before we wrap up, one quick addendum. Nova was only the first trans character in the Pokemon games. The real first trans character is much lesser known, and actually appeared 12 years earlier in a Japan-only manga called How I Became a Pokemon Card. The manga's 38th chapter stars Akari, who says he used to be a girl, but lived 13 years as a boy and believes he's a boy, despite Akari's mom making him wear girl clothes and use his girl voice, which he hates. Akari's story was the very last chapter of that manga that was ever made. If you want to see what happened to Pokemon Z, Gray, and lots more Pokemon games that never saw release, check out the Did You Know Gaming video on screen. Also, hey, I'm Jarvis, just happy to be here. I don't really make videos about Pokemon, but I have before, so if you want to see me talk about a ridiculous Pokemon TCG scam gone awry, you can click this video. Otherwise, just thanks to the team for having me. Special thanks to our translator Jacob, proofreader Snorlax Monster, Lutu for helping us find some dev interviews, and Eurasia M for grinding to find Nova for us. And of course, thank you for watching. See you next time.